So welcome again to another training event, online training event of the Planets project within our series of LCA, life cycle assessment, and today's turn on the social life cycle assessment. I would like to at first thank the people who have been contributing to the design of this training session. First of all, Laura Maniasco from RINA, but also her colleagues Martina Riccio and Lorenzo Canepa have to be mentioned there. And as always, Thomas Hennecker from TNO has been very helpful for putting together content. Also, colleagues from TNO have given input. Carla Caldera from Ciensco, Aurelia Fohet from IPC, Ponema Nagesh from the Radboud University have helped designing the session. And Stéphanie Desrousseau and Quentin Aubert from CEA will also be in one of our breakout rooms today, for example. And many thanks to Beatriz from BNN for helping with Mural and Menti to make it as interactive as possible. So thanks to the entire team running this today's session on social lifecycle assessment. What are we going to be seeing today? First of all, I will give a quick recap on what we have done so far and why we do that and how this kind of embeds into our entire series. And then I will go over to Laura Maniasco, basically, who is running more or less the frontal teaching elements and give you insight into SSbD functionality of social or positioning of social LCA in SSbD and introduces to the mechanisms how to run it. We will then see again that we have these four phases that we typically have for LCA, goal and scope. We are looking then into an interactive session where we are working on the stakeholders to make it interactive and kind of also not just have you as passive listeners, but also involve you into this kind of training session. Then we are going to be continuing with impact assessment and look into the databases and we'll cover all the different aspects that are relevant for social LCA. We will then at the end see also the how it differentiates from social acceptance assessment, which is more qualitative, of course, and involves social sciences and humanities expertise much more than the social LCA does. But let's see. In the end, we will be wrapping up this, and in the entire training session is anticipated to be not lasting longer than 2 hours. Let's see how it runs. SSbD has been mentioned, and we know probably all of us many things already about SSbD. Again, focus on this interdisciplinary connectivity between safety, sustainability aspects in the process of designing new products. So we also have to integrate these different aspects, the rather maybe absolute ones with rather relative ones, with again, absolute ones that are determining functionality, and this can be very diverse between the different sectors that we're working on. So we are now focusing on this environmental, no, not environmental, but on this kind of sustainability dimension today, where we have environmental dimension, and we have covered that already in a training before, the economic dimension, and today we focus on the social one. This is a reference to our Planet's workflow, SSbD workflow, where we have also a training session on the scoping, for example. And within this social LCA, we are, of course, in this assessment blue area. Where do you find more information about all these trainings that we have done so far? I have mentioned scoping, for example, but there was also a training on Tier 1 assessment. We did a training on QSA, then also something on fair data and digital product passport design, and the introduction of LCA, as well as environmental LCA, more deep dive into, and LCC training sessions. You find this all on our Planet's homepage in the resource chapter or menu, basically, where you have then access to the materials which are deposited in at Zenodo. And at YouTube, you also have then recordings where you can look into and listen repetitively into basically these training sessions. A few remarks on what we have seen from the LCA training series so far. The very first training session last year already was where we were introducing basically the life cycle thinking. So we were diving into that, and we are introducing you to the four main phases of LCA: the goal and scope, the inventory, the impact assessment, and then the interpretation, where also MCDA and uncertainty as important parameters or elements, functionalities were mentioned. We did the practical work on functional unit definition, which is an important aspect of LCA, then that is relevant for all types of LCA. We did this in the practical breakout rooms. We did talk about reference flow. It's also a very important term for LCA. We talked about system boundaries, did already a little bit dive into the other types of LCA, like including LCC and social LCA, but at the very high level at that time. Then we had a very dedicated session on the environmental LCA, so a deeper dive into this assessment, working on a specific case again, worked more detailed through these 4 phases, reiterated on the functional unit definition and reference flow, what it means, on a practical example as well. We heard about cradle to gate versus cradle to grave versus cradle to cradle, so a little bit into circularity dimension. Talked more details on the relevant databases and specific peculiarities of those. Then we did actually an impact assessment interactively in our practical session. There we saw what differentiates midpoints from real endpoints, how they're kind of compiled into endpoints, for example, and then did cover also this topic of data quality and sensitivity analysis. Next training session was then on LCC, so lifecycle costing. We also defined what LCC is and what LCC actually is not. So what we cannot expect from LCC, we talked about terms relevant there. CAPEX, OPEX, for example, were defined and mentioned and discussed. We were comparing LCC versus LCA inventories. We talked about primary versus secondary data. We also had the kind of interesting discussion about direct versus total costs and indirect costs. So they are relevant discussion items, I would say, that still are relevant for the conduct of LCC and should be taken into account. This came up in our interactive exercise on the cost inventory building. So pros and cons of LCC within SSbD were then kind of also gathered, I should say. We did cover also to a certain extent the topic of monetization of externalities. And finally, we talked about critical materials. And with this, I'm ready with my overview on what we have presented so far on other types of training. And we are ready for now diving into the social dimension of SSbD with the social LCA. And I would like to give over now the floor and also the screen basically to Laura for introducing us to social LCA. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Martin. So let's start by introducing again a bit the social dimension in safe and sustainable by design. This dimension is part of the lifecycle thinking approach, which is used in SSbD to assess sustainability. So the goal is to evaluate all 3 dimensions, not only the environmental sustainability. So not only you will have to do a lifecycle assessment for the environment dimension, but you also add complementary lifecycle cost for the economic and social lifecycle assessment for the social part. The social pillar, this social risk assessment, according to SSbD, can be evaluated with the social cycle assessment with a reference scale approach. We will see what it means in a bit. The overall goal is to promote social fairness, to minimize the risk of social negative impacts in your supply chain for the innovative products, and in a way to try to steer innovation towards producing societal benefits and minimizing societal negative impacts. As the framework says, the socioeconomic dimension and analysis is more suitable for comparative and relative evaluations rather than absolute assessments. This is particularly true for the economic dimension, but it is also valid for the social part. The social dimension is also connected to the design phase of SSbD in fact. One of the design principles that is included in the framework is to ensure responsible sourcing and minimize social risk. And this is quite connected with what social LCA can help you evaluate. Of course, it depends whether in your specific innovation you have chosen this type of design principle as one of the main ones. If so, then social LCA may become an important part of your SSbD assessment on the product. Because of course, as usual, the initial scoping analysis in SSbD is critical because it shapes what level of detail and what granularity you will need on certain assessments depending on your focus. What social LCA can do is to evaluate social risk in the supply chain, and so it can help mapping what regions and supplier sectors could be high risk potentially, which also means that you can also later on decide to focus on improving those aspects of your products. Of course, the social dimension is connected to the other two in sustainability, so you have to align the social LCA with the environmental and cost analysis. It builds on the already performed scoping and also on the life cycle inventory you have already done for the other two. However, the framework says that a simplified method should be used, especially at low innovation level, which means that there are some simplifications compared to the life cycle assessment. Also, simplifications in the functional unit and in the system boundaries you will use. Now, let's first have an overview in general of what social life cycle assessment is and what are its characteristics. The idea is that you can, with it, evaluate the positive and negative potential social and socioeconomic impacts of your product on different stakeholders along the life cycle. So these impacts are connected to certain stakeholders, which means groups that may be affected by your product along the supply chain and also downstream. It is again product related. It follows the same phases of life cycle assessment and life cycle cost, and it considers the whole life cycle provided you are doing a cradle to grave analysis. So it depends on the system boundaries, but the idea is that you consider the life cycle of the product. Another very important thing to note straight away is that you evaluate potential exposure to social risks, not actual impacts. And this also depends on the type of methodology used, but the most broadly used one is definitely on risk and not impacts. And we will see the difference in a bit. So in general, even outside SSbD, the possible uses of social LCA are on assessing the potential social risk across the life cycle to identify the key issues. It can also help companies in communicating the social sustainability of their products, since it is product related, contrary to other social methods and frameworks, which are more organization related. It can highlight areas for future improvement, but of course, this would be a subsequent task. So the social LCA can be the starting point for this. And then, of course, you can integrate it with the other two analyses so that you have an overview of the sustainability considering all three dimensions, which is what is done in SSbD. So we have two broad categories of social life cycle assessment depending on the method used. The first is the reference scale methods, which are also called type 1. These evaluate social risks and are the most common approach for social LCA. Then there is another option, which is impact pathway methods, or type 2. These evaluate the social impacts, which means they consider the cause-effect chains from the indicators and the primary data you measure to the effect on society, on the social dimension. This is more complex, surely a more complex analysis. At the moment, there isn't a well-established method for impact assessment, impact pathway, or there is not yet broad consensus, because it is a kind of analysis that is still being proposed in literature sources, but there is no standard way to use that method, which is why most studies use the reference scale approach, and SSbD suggests the reference scale approach. There is also a third option, which would be to do only a social life cycle inventory. So let's say stop to the point of data collection and analysis of the inventory, but we will not consider this one in this presentation. So at this point, we really need to understand what is this difference between the social risk and the social impact. When you consider a risk, you are not measuring actual impact. You're not assessing what is really happening in reality, but you start from the probability, the likelihood of having harm. And from that, you can evaluate the risk, how much it could happen. It doesn't evaluate whether harm has occurred. It doesn't reflect the severity, and it may not even consider the very specific context, but it helps because it gives you a statistical prevalence. Instead, social impact would mean to connect specific activities to a measurable change with a cause-effect chain, and it should then reflect the effective social impacts. It is a consequence of the pressure of the actions taken on social areas of protection. Evaluating social risk is surely more convenient because direct measurement of social impacts is very difficult, and that is also why it is still being developed. More in general, anyway, social LCA is a less developed assessment than environmental and cost analysis. It was born later, and so this is why it has a lower maturity. It is again iterative. It follows the same usual 4 steps of goal and scope, lifecycle inventory, impact assessment, and interpretation. In case of SSbD, of course, one can do a tiered assessment by progressively increasing the level of detail of the data, of the starting data, and so also of the results. It is based on many assumptions, as we will see, and it can have, even focusing only on the reference scale approach, either qualitative or semi-quantitative approaches to the analysis. So I will now go through all the usual steps and see what are the specific characteristics of social life cycle assessment, also compared to the other two. As usual, the current scope sets the scene, so we'll have to define what is your goal, have a definition of the system boundaries and process flows. You will have to define the functional unit, although in this case it is less relevant. But most importantly, in this case, you also have to define the stakeholder categories, the subcategories, which are the social themes of interest, and the indicators to which you measure those subcategories. So let's start with the functional unit and system boundaries. Considering what is said in the SSbD framework, as I have introduced before, there must be some simplification of the goal and scope. You have to start with the same basis of scoping and lifecycle inventory. However, it is possible that in this analysis the system boundaries will be adapted and simplified to consider only the phases of the value chain that are relevant, and the methodology itself is even a bit simplified compared to some reference scale approaches. The functional unit is optional because so the framework says, because it is less connected to what you will actually get for the social result in this case. And then, of course, these simplifications of system boundaries and functional unit is also connected to the level of detail you are at. So to the tire assessment you are considering. Of course, when you are at lower maturity, you may want to only focus on your activities and on your direct suppliers, especially if you're using questionnaires to collect data, as we will see in a bit. And then when you go to more detail and higher maturity of your product, you may want to broaden the system boundaries. So first of all, in addition to all the usual steps of goal and scope, you have to define the stakeholder categories, subcategories, and indicators. What are they? The stakeholders, they are groups that that could be affected with social impacts, positive or negative, by your product. There are standard categories of stakeholders coming from the UNIP methodology, which are the local community, value chain actors, consumers, workers, society, and children. So the idea is that you have to look at your product considering the several life cycle steps and think what are the group of people that could be in some way affected. This can also be done by considering already some of the subcategories. These subcategories, they are social themes of interest and they are connected to the stakeholders. So you will have a list of subcategories for each stakeholder, which can be taken from the standards again, or could be custom, because one could want to add other subcategories if needed to be assessed. So, for example, you can see in this table what are the subcategories of the standards, of the UNEP standards. As you can see, each stakeholder has several ones. And for example, if you take workers, one of the subcategories could be fair salary, or there is also child labor, forced labor, etc. This is a theme, a social theme, but then you have to measure it. And to measure it, you have to define an indicator. These indicators should be measurable either quantitatively or at least qualitatively. So, for example, if you consider the subcategory of fair salary, one of the indicators could be the percentage of workers below minimum wage for that country and sector. Each subcategory actually can be measured by one or more indicator. So in this other example, you can see that if you start with only one stakeholder group, workers, you have several subcategories within the stakeholder group workers, and for each of them, you may have several indicators to measure it. Okay, so this is, let's say, the broad activities that one should do in a goal and scope. So before even starting the analysis, the idea of selecting these stakeholders and subcategories and indicators is needed for two reasons mainly. First, because you have to start reflecting on your system and thinking before having the results what could be the most important aspects to be considered in the interpretation. And secondly, also because you might need this to actually prepare your data collection in practice. So before going on onto data collection so lifecycle inventory step, we will have straight away a small interactive session. This is quicker than the other times. The goal this time is to identify relevant stakeholder groups and impact subcategories in the particular case of a social lifecycle assessment of a coffee value chain. So you will be divided into groups shortly, and we will go each on a mural to fill a table. Let me first introduce to everyone the case study we are considering, this coffee value chain. The idea is that we are still on golden scope, so we only have to select stakeholders and subcategories based on what we expect. This value chain goes from cultivation to consumption. The idea is that coffee cultivation starts in Latin America, and coffee is grown on farms, which are often smallholder or family-run farms. So this coffee cultivation is the first step. After that, coffee must be prepared at local mills. Then it will be exported, so it will be transported. The further step of processing, so roasting, we can consider it will be done in the consuming countries, where it will also package for retail, and then it will be sold to customers. So some example of inputs in terms of even material inputs and outputs are, I don't know, fertilizer, pesticide, water, but then there's also labor, energy, packaging material. However, these are material inputs, while we should focus more on the people involved. There may be even also some byproducts during the production, so maybe there are also other actors involved in this. Maybe this is relevant, maybe less. We will see in discussion. You will also find in the mural some hints on how to do this brainstorming on selecting stakeholders, and you will have a table like the one I shown with the SETA stakeholders and subcategories. So the main goal is to select which could be the most important stakeholder groups among those 6. And if you can, also to see whether some of the subcategories are very important, are surely important, and whether some are surely not relevant in this case.
Welcome back. Many of you already came back from the breakout rooms. I guess it was nice to discuss over there on the different stakeholders. And I guess we are going to be using now the next 10-15 minutes for reiterating a bit what was discussed and what kind of specific questions may have come up or remarks from the different breakouts. And for this, I give again over to Laura and to Thomas and to Quentin and Stephanie for breakout room 3.
Yes.
Who wants to start?
So I will do the other way around compared to last time. I will show you an example of solution, but not really, and then I will ask the groups. So the very most important point is that there is no definitive correct answer on this. And also it is important to state again, we are in the golden scope. So we are setting the stage. The important thing is to start reflecting on the system under study, think about the life cycle steps and the stakeholder groups that may be connected to each life cycle step, even the ones that do not directly work in the production. The idea is to anticipate where to focus the interpretation phase when you get the results. And also, this is very important as a step, especially if you do your social LCA using questionnaires, as we will see later. If you do it with questionnaires that you intend to send to your stakeholders, it is unrealistic to have results on all the stakeholder categories. You have to focus on the parts that you want to study, because maybe you want to improve them, or maybe you already know that you have a high risk of having social impacts there. If you do social LCA with database instead, actually you will get results for all subcategories because they are all there in the datasets. But then by having done this preliminary selection, you can also compare what you expected with what you got and also know where you might want to go more in detail with your analysis. So in general, probably for this case study, workers should be important, but they usually are in the analysis of social SCA. You should also quite probably consider local communities and maybe some aspects about society. There may be some things about value chain actors, maybe less important than the other three categories, but debatable. And anyway, some things could be interesting. We have consumers in our system boundaries because we have also the selling of the coffee, but probably they are less important. And with children, well, they are maybe not very important in this case study. However, one thing that is could be noted is that child labor is, but if you follow the UNICEF guidelines, child labor is in workers and not in children. But still, it really depends on your goal. That's why there is no definitive right answer. Okay, so having said that, I think I will go straight to what came out in my group so I can then ask the other ones. We had one question on secure living conditions, which is one of the subcategories in local community. Good question because you might not know what they mean with this. Actually, that one is more connected to, say, security in the country in terms of military issues.
We have a look at the mural for
yes,
going through
yes.
that.
Wait, here it is. Okay, so you see you have safe and healthy and secure. They're different. One is, let's call it sanitary, sort of, and the other is more on the security of the country. Then we also had some hypotheses on specific stakeholders. For the local community, well, we may want to consider them close to the cultivation plants and maybe also where the mills for processing are, because one of the subcategories is the local employment. Maybe less important in the consuming countries, but then you also have land owners, which might go into local community or maybe also value chain actors. Depends also on what you are actually assessing, to be honest. Like, for example, small farms, they are to be considered because of their workers, but they may again also be considered as value chain actors. And as we have said, there's this thing about child labor. Okay. Maybe I'll go in order and switch to breakout group 2 if you have any insight.
Yeah, sure. We had some interesting discussions about the actual table, but we also had a few points that were meta, not about the table itself, but about the assessment. I put them all at the top, and I think maybe they're interesting to relay to the larger group. We talked about risk, but we also thought about a few benefits that could happen with coffee trading, like salary and being able to send your children to school. And it doesn't seem like the framework is set up to be able to account for benefits, so we were wondering about this. We also tried to put crosses, and we found it very difficult. There was always some way in which this could be affected, it seemed. So it was difficult to fully rule out any of the risk. And then the last topic we had for this meta discussion was interdependencies. It seemed like some of the categories were definitely influencing one another. Like as soon as you're going to have child labor and child health and child education might be threatened. And also interdependencies between social risks and other categories. If you don't account for climate change, then you will eventually have impacts on your agriculture as a farmer. So your use of fertilizer should be controlled or something like this. These dependencies also made us discuss a few things. I don't know that you have answers for all of those. I think these are all very difficult questions, but they were interesting discussions.
Yes, some of them are very difficult. Some of them are, let's say, limited because of what is usually done in the social LCA methods, like considering climate change. No, we are not yet there. I don't think there is any way to do this, as far as I know. Yes, there are interdependencies, and what is true is that really here we are not considering indicators because each of these subcategories are assessed with indicators and you have to choose them unless you have the standard ones from the database. And I'm not sure whether some indicators are actually connected to more than one subcategory, but surely there is superposition of some things. I mean, as topics, there surely is. About the positive aspects, there are some, even if you consider only the subcategory titles, let's call it. But then again, it depends on indicators you use and on what is in the software if you're using the databases. Like, for example, the society one has technology development, which is positive. And so poverty alleviation, if you put it that way, then it is positive technically. And there's also contribution to economic development. So yes, some of them are positive in their but in their title, let's call it. But then it depends on indicators.
Okay.
Yes, I think those are the answers I have. And I think I will move to breakout 3.
Yes.
Here we are.
So we had a lot of proposition. I would say we had the focus that you were talking about on workers and local communities, at least in terms of talking out on what are the different subcategories. But some question to problematic to understand some of the subcategories. Maybe they are not sometimes not defined enough. So, for example, access to immaterial resource is a bit difficult to understand. We had some talk about the overlapping also of different subcategories for the children and for the workers with child labor. And what was also really interesting is that we had a lot of suggestions for consumers and children, which are subcategories that are often less evaluated in assessments. So that both was interesting.
Yes, that's true. And often also the use phase altogether is overlooked in social LCA, in part because it is harder to find indicators and to get answers if you use questionnaires, and also in the social databases you have less indicators for those, which means you tend to focus on the supply chain more than on the downstream. Yes, and thank you. There are also really many things here to be considered. Oh, that's nice. That's very nice because they're very specific. Good. So we can go on with the next steps. Inventory and assessment. And we will also see this thing about the questionnaires and the social databases, which I have already anticipated because it is connected a bit with what we have seen. Of course, inventory along the whole life cycle, provided your system boundaries are cradle to grave. We have different data collection methods and also sources of information. It also depends a bit on the approach because social life cycle assessment can be very qualitative or can go towards semi-quantitative or quantitative values. So to collect these data, you can use questionnaires or you can use social databases or a mix of the two if you really want to. And also impact assessment and the results you get change depending on the method you use. In general, anyway, within impact assessment, there is also always some sort of classification. So you connect your inventory data with the social impact subcategories. And in both cases, you characterize your results based on risk levels. Remember, we are always considering in this webinar the reference scale approach. The impact scale is not here. today. And sometimes, in particular when you use the social databases, you can get the conversion to a common unit, which is medium risk hours, and we will see about that. Okay, so the two options, questionnaires or databases. Questionnaires must be, usually they have to be created, so they are custom for your case study. You have to create a questionnaire, you have to select the stakeholders, subcategories, select the indicators, collect the information on the indicators, and you really need a direct involvement with the organization producing the product under study and possibly its supply chain, because you should also consider the impacts upstream. So at least the first suppliers, the direct suppliers, but the idea would be also to consider something even upstream. All in all, more case specific, surely, but highly time consuming. The other option is to use social databases. The two most important one are sLCA and social outputs database. In this case, the organization producing the product should provide input and output flow quantities and their cost and the country of origin of the raw materials for the product. And then the rest is done with secondary data, so with the datasets in the two databases. And what you get is less case specific because you estimate the social risk via country sector level data. So before focusing a bit on the two options, a note on the data you have. In the first column, you have a consideration on the scale of the data. This also, by the way, comes from the SSbD framework, so it is really also on topic, let's say, when you do SSbD, but it is true in general. So the point is, when you collect social data, usually it is not feasible to have this data at the chemical, material, or product level, because what you can get as site-specific data is still at the level of the company or organization. So they are indicators that are connected to the social responsibility of the organization and of the supply chain. The more general scale is the country sector level. And in that case, it means you are collecting data by statistics, national statistics, or from the databases, and you're considering risk estimates for your global supply chains. The positive aspect of those data, although they are more broad and less specific, is that you can go very much upstream with them. So consider even the upstream sector of your upstream sector and go very much to the whole supply chain. Then there is the classic separation, primary and secondary data, like you do with environmental SCA after all. Primary data is the one that is site-specific, so it should reflect as much as possible the real organization behavior. You collect it via stakeholders or directly if you have access to their sustainability reports, maybe. But if you collect it directly, which would be the ideal way, you can use surveys, interviews, or even fieldwork. And if you do social SCA with the questionnaires, so the first option we saw, the main data should come as primary, and then if necessary, it can be complemented with some secondary data. Secondary data is the one at country sector level generally, and it is the one from literature databases and reports. And this is what is used in the databases after all. So you have primary data because you have the cost and country of origin and the amount of your raw materials in your supply chain, but then you evaluate the risk based on the secondary data. Bit more detail on the questionnaires. As I have already said, you have to select the relevant social aspects because for each of them, you have to select viable indicators, and for each indicator, you also have to prepare a reference scale, which you need to evaluate the performance of the organization and supplier that provide you the data. So in this table, you see an example from the SSbD framework, one socioeconomic aspect, an example of two indicators. Each of them has a reference scale which means you consider the values you get from the indicators and rank them into levels. So you have to collect this information for each indicator. It may be qualitative or semi-quantitative or quantitative, depending on the indicators you choose. And yes, you should collect this from the organization and all the upstream actors and the downstream actors. The level of detail the expected data needs depend on the chosen indicators, of course. But I think you can already see that it is very long and time consuming. The reference scale means that you have to classify the performance into levels, as I have said, but you have to create those levels. So you have also to collect information on a performance reference point, which becomes your benchmark to create the levels. And in general, this comes from international norms. Which means that, for example, you have, I don't know, percent of children in employment with a certain age. You know from the standards what is the general value, and then you also create this level of scales. Some of these scales are already known because they have been used in previous methods. But if you include in your questionnaire custom indicators, you may want to do that, then you would have to really create your risk scale on your own. You might also want to use common indicators but have your own scale. So it is very flexible. And on the other hand, you might have a risk attribution that is subjective. And really, I mean, it may be very specific to your case study, but it makes it less comparable with other studies. So in short, some positive and negative considerations. Positive aspect is that it is more site-specific because you do collect more site-specific data, so you also get more site-specific results. You consider your own supply chain, ideally. However, this is very time and research consuming. You still get qualitative or semi-quantitative results at best, because at the end of your risk level attribution, you still get classification into levels. You may want to look at the raw data themselves, of course, but that's what you get. There are some issues connected to this big data collection, because you might need to use only a few indicators to reduce the amount of data to be collected. You
We lost Laura again, right?
let's see. Yes, I saw
La-
that I wasn't there. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you again. Maybe you want to repeat the last minute or something.
Oh yes, 1 minute. Okay, I was
No, not a
hoping for
minute,
less.
maybe half a minute or something. It was really interesting.
Okay, yes. So the pros and cons. Well, I have already said that a bit while going through the slides, really. The good part is it is more site-specific, but it is very long. And you might need to restrict your indicator list and your system boundaries. So less indicators and maybe focus only on the main actors. Then there is one, well, it is not an issue more than something it should be taken into account. In general, when you collect data on social indicators, you get information at the organization level, which might be tricky to be converted into a product level, because for many social issues, you know what happens based on the social responsibility, but you can't appropriately attribute it to a single product sometimes. And then our usual problem, I think I can call it that, low data availability at low TRL, because you can't involve suppliers yet if you don't know them yet, or maybe you might need to change suppliers. And this is probably a bigger issue with questionnaires rather than with using the databases. Because in the case of databases, you have sector country level data, so generic data, so you can use it and maybe have some sensitivity analysis on this. While in this case, if you have to collect primary data and you don't have your suppliers yet, you can't collect it. Okay. Now moving on to the option with databases. The inventory in this case is based on economic flows. So dollars spent per sector country based on your supply chain. But it is also based on an activity variable of working hours, and we will see in a bit. And then on the social risk indicators that are attributed to the country sectors. Data collection is simpler because you can start with the data you collected for LCA and lifecycle cost. And then you can add the country of origin of your materials, possibly. The idea is that the whole model starts with a model on the economic input and output flows for your product. So from your raw materials, you switch to the cost, like in lifecycle cost, and you start from that to convert to the social risk. So in the model, each of these cost flows is associated with one country sector dataset in the database. This is because both databases have a list of sectors and divided by country, and they already have the social risk for those, and you can connect them in your inventory based on the cost amounts of your inventory. One thing to know straight away, the two databases have different datasets and indicators, which means that the same cost model gives different results depending on the database you use. In general, both of them are based on the same methodology, let's say, although they are different in the sources they use. And one thing to note is that in this case, as I was saying some slides earlier, you can get results for your whole supply chain upstream, although it is based on secondary data. So for example, in sLCA, you can see there in the picture, you have all the social indicators. Note that the list might not be exactly the same as you see in the eLCA, the one we have used in the interactive session. And then for each country, you have a list of sectors, like the example for UK in the picture, and you can select from that. Each of these datasets, which are available for the country and for sector, like, for example, metal products manufacturing in Italy, inside they have the amount of worker hours necessary to produce the $1 output, because they are all scaled to this $1 output. They are already connected to their global supply chain. This is done by using a multi-regional input and output model based on the economic flows. And they also have the risk level for that country sector for multiple social teams, so for different impact subcategories. Let's go to the next slide to see a bit of what these risk levels are. It is in a way similar to what I have shown with questionnaires, in the sense that the indicator values are assigned a risk level based on the range they fall in. These risk levels, this is the example for sLCA, are from very low to very high. After that, to each risk level, a numerical value is assigned. In this case, a logarithmic scale, which means that if you have a very low risk level, then you would get a factor of 0.01. If you have a very high, you get a factor of 100. This is used to convert the working time, that worker hours, which is our activity variable, and the risk level to a single quantitative value, which means that in the end, you get a common unit, medium risk hours, which is obtained by multiplying this factor for the risk level per the hours worked for $1 output. And this way, you get a medium risk hour value for all the indicators. And why do we want to do this? Because like this, we can aggregate the impacts across the value chain for each indicator. And then if you want, you can also sum all the mid-risk hours for the indicators together and get one single score. This unit, medium risk hours, should represent the number of working hours along the supply chain characterized by a certain level of social risk. And the idea is that the higher the value, the higher the risk, which means worse performance. I will now show you an example just to see how these things work in practice. We have two scenarios here coming from a presentation by TNO, which I thank for the support. The scenarios are consider just one material, wood. In scenario 1, you have 10 kilograms of wood as an input to your product, let's say, and you know that you pay $2 per kilogram, which means you will have to pay in total $20 for your wood. You have your country sector dataset, which tells you that there are 0.05 hours working hours per dollar produced, which means that in your case, you will have 1 working hour. And the dataset also tells you that for a certain impact category, a certain indicator, let's say child labor, you have high risk. High risk means that you have a factor of 10. The result is that for that input of yours, you have 10 medium risk hours. If in another scenario you consider just 1 kilogram of wood and same working hours, but then it means you have 0.1 in your case. However, for some reason, maybe you have selected another country in this scenario, you have very high risk, well, then that means that the factor you have to apply is 100 because you have a factor of 10, which means you get again 10 medium risk hours. So first of all, care should be taken with these results, but it is also a very practical way to consider, let's say, the level of risk and have an overall result. So this is also part of the reason why it makes more sense to have comparative evaluations and not focus on the absolute values. And anyway, very important to always remember that a high risk value does not mean harm has occurred. It means harm is likely. Summing up what happens inside a database and its datasets, as we have seen all of this in your dataset for a certain country sector, you have $1 of output for that sector in that country. You are also the connection to all the sectors that come in the supply chain of that one, thanks to the global input-output model. You also have the worker hours needed to produce that $1 output, which is based on a calculation I won't show in this presentation. Then you have the assessment of the indicators, for which you have some raw values depending on the single indicators. For example, here you have the fatal accident at workplace. You have a certain number per 100,000 employees. To that number, risk levels are assigned. Risk levels are also converted through characterization factors to get a single unit of measure of medium risk hours, which is also connected to the number of work hours. And all in all, you get this result for each of the sectors you have included in your own inventory, so that you can also do your own total for your product. Final note on this topic, as I said at the beginning, the two databases have different social impact subcategories and different classification of those, because they start from different multi-regional input and output models. They also have different country sectors datasets, which means that if you tried to do the same model with the two datasets, you would get different results in terms of amount, but also in terms of the relative importance of the impact categories. Even though some of them are similar, they would still be probably in a different ranking. So finally, what can you do with these results you get? First of all, you can try to visualize them to have an overview of what are the main indicators. So as at the point of results, you will have all the indicators with a value in medium risk hours, and you can see which ones are the ones with the highest values. You can also try to regroup this by stakeholder category, by impact subcategory, or you could try to regroup them by life cycle stage, or for example by flow type, like in this example. So you decide you want to divide based on the raw material flow type, you can do that. Another quite nice thing is comparing different countries. So in this example, you have the same sector in different countries, and you compare the medium risk hours for certain impact subcategories to see which country has the highest, or whether there is always one of them with highest values for all the indicators, or if there are some specific problems depending on the specific country. The final outcome is that you can do a hotspot analysis to find the potentially critical socioeconomic risks in your supply chain, again, based on country sector data, but still could be useful because even though they are not specific to your supplier, you can still start by seeing what happens in general in the sector and country, and then see whether you want to proceed with more detailed analysis on your specific supply chain. It can be used, of course, to compare results, like compare to products or compare to two countries for the same sector, as I've shown in the last slide. And of course, this can lead to recommendations, but they must always be connected to the assessment limitations that we have seen. So in short, social databases help you because less primary data is needed. You can get a single output, a semi-quantitative, let's call it outcome, because you have that medium risk hours value. It can become very detailed, but it is good also for rapid screening, high-level comparisons, like the one for countries. But of course, it is less site-specific. It gives high-level data, and it gives high-level results. It is based on economic flows, which means that it is strictly connected to what you get in your life cycle cost inventory. And there is also one other problem, let's call it, that is worth mentioning. Suppose you have two flows that you want to compare because maybe you have two products which have a difference in the raw materials. Well, if those two flows are actually classifiable in the same sector, and they are produced in the same country, then it means that their risk levels are modeled in the same way, which means that the only difference will be the cost difference, meaning the cheapest one will get lower medium risk hours, because if they are modeled with the same sector in the database, that's the only difference between them. This should be taken into account when you do comparisons. And then, of course, we have, as always, the problem of low TRL. Although I might say that maybe it is even more important if you are using questionnaires, but still, if you are at low innovation level, you will have uncertainty on prices. And if you use prices, you will also have uncertainty on what you get with the social SCA. And if you are at very low TRL and you still are not sure about your inputs, you might not have even defined the supplier's country. However, in this case, maybe it becomes even more relevant to try to do a comparison by country, which is a way one could try to choose the best supplier country if you don't have already that information beforehand. Very good. I will sum up a bit because we have seen many things. First of all, summing up on the, let's say, levels of the social life cycle assessment impacts. You have stakeholder groups. For each stakeholder group, you have several social topics, which are generally called social subcategories. For each of them, you have several indicators which measure the performance, either the performance of your specific supply chain if you use questionnaires, or the performance of the country sector. These performances are evaluated in reference scale. Again, we are considering reference scale approach, which means that you get a certain level of risk. The example in this picture is more like for questionnaires, because as you see, you have the -2+2 scale, which is more qualitative. But the concept is more or less the same also for the databases. We have seen that, particularly if you're using databases, but more in general, we are considering probabilistic risk because we are considering likelihood of negative conditions, not actual impacts that have occurred. If you use database, or in general, if you use secondary data, you will have a macro scale result because it will be based on country sector data. That also if you use national statistics, for example, which means that you actually only have a proxy for impact because you're using social performance indicators to infer risk. But it can be a useful tool for prioritization to target critical supply chain areas. And what does the databases do? Well, they quantify social risk across country-specific sectors. They gather data from sources, from country-level sources. They convert them into risk level, and then they translate them into scores so that you can aggregate using medium risk hours, which are the worker hours exposed to risk. And this is the very final conclusion. So remember again that social LCA in particular is part of the life cycle thinking, so it is related to the product life cycle. One thing to note, without repeating what we have already said, as usual, if you want to include another dimension in SSbD, it means you need experts to do it. And it also means that complexity in evaluation is increased. So yes, we are considering all sustainability dimensions, so it is important to have all of them. But on the other side of the coin, of course, you also have to have expertise to do the assessment, but also to interpret results as usual. I think we can go to a quick Menti. we're almost at the end, but we would like to ask you some questions. The question? Well, none of them was right, to be honest, because social SCA actually can't do any of these things fully or alone, at least. However, there are many other social related assessments that can be used for these topics. So social LCA is product related, and if we consider our reference scale approach, it evaluates potential risk. User needs and expectations, these are not connected to social LCA, but they can be evaluated either on questionnaires on the technical parts, and also partially with the social acceptance assessment, which we will see in a bit because it is part of plans. And so right now I will show you what a very quick way to have an idea of the difference with social LCA. Social acceptance can also help to identify stakeholder trust and perceptions on the product social positive and negative impacts. Instead, the other options were either more connected to your organization, like the workplace practices, or to the supply chain, which can be in part evaluated with supply chain due diligence. And lastly, about the option on the actual social impacts, well, social LCA can help because we have seen it. It can help you steer your attention. However, since it is based on potential risk, and in particular, if you are doing it with databases, then it is not enough. Other options are needed. First, maybe a bit of help from the supply chain due diligence, but then maybe human rights impact assessment or even other more focused evaluations. Well, what is this social acceptance? What is the difference with social SCA? So first of all, we can say that social SCA is a systematic methodology in the sense that it is based on the standards and still connected to life cycle thinking. It has a specific selected list of stakeholder groups and subcategories if you follow the standards. Instead, social acceptance is more usually performed via surveys, engagement with the stakeholders, communication. It is probably more custom. Social LCA evaluates potential social risk. It is social lifecycle based and product based. Instead, social acceptance evaluates perceptions, drivers, and barriers to the stakeholder acceptance of your product. It is stakeholder focused and more context specific. It evaluates how people feel, while social LCA may only evaluate what may happen in terms of risk and in terms of probability, after all, of risk. And there's also this difference about potential social risk and perception, because social acceptance is on what your stakeholders think, not on actual impacts that your product has. So what can you do with social acceptance and what are its characteristics? Well, it can help ensuring innovation generates societal value. It starts with the stakeholder mapping to define the scope and target groups and appropriate tools to be used. It deploys surveys to assess the awareness, the trust, and perceptions of the stakeholders towards the product or the project. It can identify drivers and barriers for social acceptance. It could support exploitation or market integration studies because of its consideration of the potential customers, for example. And it can be a starting point to then develop some awareness actions to enhance the acceptance and adoption of the product. And yes, with this, we have concluded our training. And before handing over to Martin for the conclusions, I would like to thank Dr. Scholtes for providing the presentation Ethics and Data in Social LCA, which informed some of the content on social risk and on sLCA and social output database differences. And I would also like to thank the Chisuflov project, which was included in that presentation. So thank you. And I will hand over to Martin now.
And I would like to thank you, Laura from RENA, for running the session. Everybody who has been involved in designing the session as well from the team of Planets. So a very quick wrap up from my side. What have we seen? We have seen social LCA is very relative, rather comparable and far off absolute measures. We have seen that methodologies are in development, especially for impact pathway assessment. And at the moment, we are kind of identifying risks in the reference scale methodology, which is the preferred one from according to the SSbD framework, or it has been mentioned as the one to be used there. Then we have been working on this coffee value chain, which is a prominent one, and it's, I guess, quite well noted also in general society. I mean, we have this fair trade coffee since quite a while. We have looked into the indicators of these stakeholders. That was quite interesting in the categories, subcategories there and the indicators. Then we have heard about the most important two databases there, a little bit seen how they are differentiating from each other. We have talked about primary versus secondary data in this context as well. Then we talked about also database versus questionnaire-based LCA and what kind of advantages or disadvantages the one or the other might have. Finally, they looked at ways how to interpret and visualize the results. And in the end, Laura also gave us an insight on what social LCA is different from social acceptance assessment, which is a more detailed, qualitative, while the other one may be semi-quantitative way. While the other one is, so the social LCA is maybe focusing on what may happen. The other one is rather focusing on how people do feel. So I guess we got a good insight into social LCA. It has been an element of our training series on LCA in general. There were also these other sessions. If you cannot recall some content from environmental LCA, for example, and you wanna go back to, say, life cycle costing, for example, or you have not had a chance to participate live here with us, no matter, go back to our training resources on the webpage of Planets Project. Everything is deposited there, and it guides you towards Zenodo uploaded files, which you can work yourself through with a small team, or you can even operate it in the company with your colleagues. This might be nice learning for all of you guys. And then what we are going to be seeing next is then in probably something like April this year, together with Eva Hahn from Wacker and Susan Deckers and Neeraj Chandilia from TNO, a session on MCDA, so decision support, based on the categories of these LCA trainings, will be provided. Thanks again for your contributions. Thanks again for your cooperation and your lively discussions in the breakout rooms. If there are any questions remaining at the moment, or comments or concerns, we are very open to that now. Follow us, stay in tune. Here are the Planets projects homepage mentioned, where you find the resources, or not just the training resources, but also other available materials. Stay tuned with us on LinkedIn. Happy to interact with you guys.